continuing our study on the church of Smyrna tonight. We're going to pick up in Revelations 2:8. I'm going to read the passage again just so to kind of refresh everybody. It says, "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." Before we get into the meat of what we're going to talk about tonight, I want to make this one point, because last week we spent a lot of time talking about persecution and the intense persecution that the church has gone through, and even the little bit of persecution that, we're, if you could even call it that we're experiencing here in America. But notice he says this, "Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison." So I think what he does there is he cuts through this tendency that we have to blame governmental leaders, politicians, sinners for what's happening in our world. And he goes right to it. He says, "Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison." And I think that's a much better perspective, because if you're not careful, you can kind of become this angry Christian who's mad at the government, mad at sinners because of what our experience is in the nation, when in fact, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We are not battling against flesh and blood. There is something behind this. So anything you see happening in our nation that's kind of a target or aggressive against Christians is coming from our real enemy, which is Satan. And I think that's a very important perspective for us to have. We're not fighting humans. We're not even fighting a government. We're fighting the devil. And so when you know that, there's a particular way to engage him and to battle that. The phrase I want to focus on, he says here, because last week we focused on the tribulation part, but another thing he notices and commends them on is their poverty. And then he makes this kind of caveat. He says, "But actually, you are rich." So he's not commending them for being poor, for the sake of being poor. That's not his point. They are poor for the gospel's sake. Because as we talked about the tribulation last week, many of them were losing jobs, property, so it's their faithfulness to the gospel that led to this poverty. He's not commending them for just choosing to be poor. They are poor as a result of their faithfulness to Christ and their faithfulness to the gospel. Their commitment and loyalty to the gospel is what has actually led to their impoverished state. But I love the next statement. He says, so you're impoverished, but you are rich. You are way more rich than you could ever imagine, because your riches are in heaven. And he said the true riches, the things that I truly value, you may be poor when it comes to property, land, finances, but when it comes to spirituality and your reward in heaven, he says you are rich. And that had to be such a encouragement to them to know and understand that yes, we may be poor here, but it just shifted them and helped them focus on the eternal aspect of it, that no, while you think you might be poor, you are actually very rich. So how were they rich? If Jesus said you're poor but you're actually rich, how are they rich? I think the first way is spiritually. Obviously, this church had a spiritual depth to them, a spiritual richness, that their relationship with Christ was deep. I think about the persecution that Jesus prophesied was going to come in the end, that he said even the very elect would be deceived if possible. And so these guys are going through this type of persecution, but they're not being deceived. They're remaining faithful. They're remaining loyal. So their spiritual depth had to be very deep. There had to be a maturity there to their relationship with God, to their prayer lives, to their knowledge of the Word. All the things that leads to spiritual maturity. Jesus said you are rich when it comes to that. And I think another way they were rich was eternally, because we know that there are rewards in heaven for sacrifices that we make here for the temporal that are going to lead to rewards in eternity. So I think eternally they were rich as far as their inheritance in Christ and what it means to be a son or daughter of God. They were rich. So to simplify what Jesus was saying, he's saying you're poor outwardly, but you're rich inwardly. And unfortunately, what we see today many times is the opposite, especially in America. We see people that are rich outwardly, but poor inwardly. And of course, we know that for sinners, but what about for Christians? Even in Christians, I see this many times in the church where we have all the temporal things on the outside. We have all the things that should make us happy. We have the job, the car, the boat, the friendship circle. We have all these outward things that is, I guess, what you might call the American dream. But then how many people that have all that, they're dying on the inside. They're poor on the inside. They're depressed. They're not happy. Those things their richness on the outside has not made them happy. They're actually poor. And I see this a lot in church. And probably the best example of this was when Jesus had the strong rebuke for the Pharisees in Matthew 23. Verse 25, he said, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! For you clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, then the outside, that the outside may also be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." Anytime you read any rebuke to the Pharisees, it's so easy to just point the finger at them, kind of like as our whipping boy, and just go, "Oh, the Pharisees, they were such evil people, and go get them, Jesus," type thing. But I think that this applies to a lot more than just the Pharisees. It applies to a lot more of our lives than just the Pharisees. Because I think all of us have this tendency, I don't care who you are, I don't care how spiritual you are, this tendency to focus on the outside of the cup is in every one of us. And I think the reason is because it's so much more visible. And so when you're trying to impress man or you're trying to impress people, what's the first thing you go to? Clean up the outside, just the part that's visible, just the part that people are going to see, because that'll give me the best impression. And it's easier to neglect the inside in your personal spirituality. It's easier to neglect that because it's not as readily visible, and it takes longer for it to show up, and it will show up. If you are neglecting your spiritual life, it will show up. But sometimes it takes years for that to show up in a person's life, the effects, because it's been almost like rotting underneath the surface, and you don't know it until it's revealed. I've told this story before where when Jennifer and I bought our first house, we had this pear tree in the backyard that, I was so excited about when the spring came, because I just knew it was going to produce this big bunch of pears. And so the spring came, and all the leaves on all the other trees in the yard were coming out, but the leaves on this tree were not coming out. And I thought, well, maybe, it's just a late bloomer, so I just kind of waited, and the leaves never bloomed. It never came. So I went out there and I looked at it. I said, well, what's going on? I started looking around a little bit, and I put my hand on it, and the whole thing just fell over right there in the grass, and just the whole roots and everything were exposed from the bottom. And so, unbeknownst to me, that tree was dead. It didn't look dead when we were in the winter, because all the trees looked that way. But when we got into the spring, it was revealed that actually it had been dead for who knows how long. No one knew. And I think that's how a lot of Christians' lives are. They just kind of come into church like they're propped up, and they on the outside they look like other Christians, but inwardly they're dead, they're dried up, they're rotting on the inside. And there's going to be that moment where it is revealed that there's no spiritual life, in you. And so what I would say is, rather than wait until, you get that proverbial hand on you that pushes you over and the roots are revealed, make the adjustments now. Start, and it's not hard. One of my favorite verses in Scripture is in James chapter 4. Draw near to God, and He will draw near to you. I encourage people with this all the time because I use this principle. When I feel far from God, I know all I have to do is draw near, and He will draw near to me. So if you feel that way, start taking the steps in the right direction to get to that place where your spiritual life is coming back alive and that vibrancy is coming back into your relationship. Look at the church in Smyrna as an example. They were under this intense persecution, and Jesus commended them for the tribulation they endured, and because of being impoverished as a sign of their commitment to the gospel. So they had this richness and this spiritual depth to them. And what I would encourage those in life groups tonight to do is to look at your own life and go, do you identify more with the church of Smyrna, or do you identify more with the Pharisees? Are you focusing on external richness or internal? Are you cleaning the outside of the cup, or are you focusing on the internal?